Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Great Western Trail El Paso. Great Western Trail El Paso comes with all of the components that you see here, including 1 cattle board, a building board, 4 player boards, 4 train cards, 20 bonus tiles and 20 objective tiles, 11 bot cards, 16 exchange tokens, a cloth game board, 12 common buildings, 6 neutral buildings, player components in the different player colors, a number of coins in $1 and $5 values, a number of different market cattle cards and Simmental cattle cards, 48 total worker cards, and 40 player cattle cards. The game also comes with some helpful storage boxes and a score sheet. To begin setup, place the cloth board in the middle of the table. Then take the El Paso tile and place it on the space marked for El Paso. Then, for all of the other common building tiles, place them on the spaces whose letter matches the letter on their tile. After you're done, it'll look like this. Then take all of the train cards and place them face up in a line near the play area. Next, take all of the objective and bonus tiles, shuffle those and place them near the train, and then draw and place 3 tiles face up from each stack near the play area. Then place the coins and the exchange tokens near the play area to form the bank. Then place the cattle board near the play area. After that, you'll separate out each specific breed of cow and place them in stacks, matching their indicated space near the cattle board. Then you'll place the building board near the play area and create stacks of the common buildings near each of the spaces on the board that matches their cost. Then create face-up stacks of the 4 different worker types near the play area as well. This is referred to as the worker supply. Then you'll place a number of the Simmental cattle on their designated space in the middle of the player board, depending on the player count. In our 2-player example, we'll place 9 cards as a stack here, and the remaining cards can be placed back in the box. Then each player will take a player board and place it in front of themselves. They'll take their 7 player discs and place them on these spaces of their player board, leaving these 2 cog spaces on the left side of the player board open. They'll place their certificate marker on the 0 space of their certificate track. The 2 property markers they'll leave near their player board, and their herder meeple, which for now they'll leave near their player board. Each player will then receive a 10-player cattle deck, comprised of 4 Criollo, 2 black Piney Woods, 2 white Galloway, and 2 green Santa Gertrudis cards. Each player will then shuffle this deck of cards and place them to the left of their player board, and leave room on the right side of their player board for a discard pile. Each player will then draw 4 cards as their starting hand. After a random start player is determined, each player will receive a number of coins and exchange tokens depending on their player count. Each player will also receive 1 each of the different worker types from the worker supply and place them face up below their player board. This will be known as each player's worker area. Finally, beginning with the start player and then in a clockwise direction, each player will select 1 of the objective tiles, which will immediately be replaced before the next player chooses their objective tile. These can be placed near each player's play area. After this has been done, you're ready to play. The goal of Great Western Trail El Paso is to be the player with the most victory points in their display at the end of the game. Players will move their markers around the map, visiting different locations, eventually completing a loop by returning to El Paso. Once in El Paso, players will deliver their herds of cattle to try and get higher and higher rewards, earning them more victory points. In addition to their herd values, players will also earn points by acquiring better cattle, acquiring bonus tiles and completing objectives, building buildings, constructing common buildings, hiring better workers, and having the most money in their supply. The player with the highest victory point total would be the winner. Beginning with the start player and then going in a clockwise direction, each player will take a full turn. And on their turn, players must carry out the following 3 steps in order. First, players will move, then they'll take actions, and then they'll draw up to their full hand size. On the very first turn of the game only, players are allowed to place their worker on any neutral location besides El Paso and then take the actions at that chosen location. So for instance, this player could choose to go here and take their first actions of the game. More than one player can be on a location, so this player could choose to come to the same location on their first turn. After the first turn of the game, players have to move along the path following their step count. At the start of the game, a player's step count is 3. This can be improved to 4 by delivering particular values of cattle herd, but we'll look at that in more detail later in the video. When determining their step count, players have to move their workers along the trail following the direction of the arrows, and each time they visit a location, that would count as 1 step. Empty locations that don't have a building yet don't count when calculating movement. So for instance, this yellow player could move 1, 2, 3 spaces if they wanted to, and these spaces wouldn't count against them. On a future turn, however, if the red player had built this common building in this location, this would now count as a step, so the yellow player could move 1, 2, 3 before reaching their final limit. If there's a fork in the path, you can choose which direction you want to go, and that still only counts as 1 step. And other players' pieces won't inhibit your movement at all. Once again, you can be on the same space with another worker. So for instance, moving here would be 1 step, and you could stop here or continue moving along to another location. If a player reaches El Paso, any additional movement is lost. They have to stop and complete all of the steps at the bottom of the El Paso tile. We'll look at these steps in detail later in the video. After a player ends their movement, they would then take the actions of the location that they reached. If a player lands on a neutral location or a location with their own player marker on it, meaning a building that they own, that player can either carry out the depicted actions on the tile, or they can carry out what's known as an auxiliary action. It's important to note that players can always just do an auxiliary action if they want to, even if they land on a tile where they would have other options. So for instance, if this player landed on their own building tile, they could take one of these auxiliary actions if they want to. At the start of the game, only 2 auxiliary actions are unlocked. These other auxiliary actions can be unlocked later in the game by delivering herds of cattle. This action would allow a player to gain 1 coin. This action would allow a player to gain 1 temporary certificate, which can be used to increase a herd's value when delivering to El Paso. This auxiliary action would allow a player to draw a card from their deck and then discard 1 of the cards from their new hand. And this auxiliary action would allow a player to remove a card from their hand from the game completely. We'll once again look at unlocking these different actions and bonuses later in the video. It's important to note that if a player lands on a building that has another player's property marker, the only option they have is to take one of their auxiliary actions. If, however, a player lands on a common building or a building that they own and they want to take the actions of the tile, they can choose to take any or all of the actions in any order they would like to. We'll go through all the actions in detail now. On this tile, a player could increase their certificate marker by 1 on their temporary certificate track and gain $2 in any order they choose. Anytime a player sees this action icon on a tile, this means that a player can take an auxiliary action. So they could take 1 auxiliary action from the options that we just looked at. Anytime a player sees this icon, a card with an arrow pointing down, that means they could discard that type of card from their hand to gain the listed reward on the right side. In this example, the red player would be able to discard a value 1 gray card from their hand, and if they do, they would gain 3 coins. Other tiles have similar actions. For instance, this tile would allow you to discard a black 2 for 2 coins, and this tile would allow you to discard a green 2 card for 2 coins. Anytime you see a monetary value with a negative symbol next to it, that means that taking this action has a cost that's associated. So for instance, to take this action, a player would be able to gain 1 of the available bonus tiles from the display by paying $2. This action would allow a player to gain one of these exchange markers at a cost of $1. There are some action spaces, however, that allow you to gain these things for free. For instance, this action would allow you to gain an exchange marker without paying anything, and this action once again would allow you to do an auxiliary action on your board. Anytime a player sees this icon, a cowboy figure with another step value, this means that the player, after taking the other associated action on the tile, would then get to move this number of steps and take an additional action. For instance, after gaining this bonus tile if they wanted to, this player could then move 1 additional space along the path and then take the actions at the tile where they just landed again. Now that we've looked at some of the more straightforward actions, let's look at the actions to hire workers, build buildings, and gain cattle. If a player visited this tile, they could discard a white 2 to get 2 coins if they wanted to, and then they could hire 2 different workers from the worker supply. To hire these workers, the first one would cost 5 coins, as you can see here, and then the second worker that's different would cost 8 coins. So for instance, if a player wanted to, they could hire a cowboy for 5 coins and then hire an engineer for 8, or any combination of these 2 workers. If they wanted to, a player could also just hire one of these workers. It's important to note, however, that if a player ever wants to hire one of the wild workers, they will always cost 4 additional coins on top of the cost that you have to pay for the action. So for example, if a player wanted to hire a wild worker as their first worker, they would have to pay the 5 coins for the action space, and then 4 additional coins showing on the card to get this wild worker in their supply. Once a player hires a worker, they would be placed below the player's play area in what's known as their worker area. These workers will stay in this area until they're used to complete an action on a future turn, which we'll look at here in a moment. If a player comes to this location and decides to take this action, this would allow them to buy cattle. When buying cattle, players would be able to buy any of the face-up cattle from the display. To do so, however, they would have to pay the costs listed next to each cattle card. To buy this cow, a player would have to discard 1 cowboy or wild worker from below their board and pay $2. To buy this cow, they would have to discard 2 workers and pay $4, 3 workers and pay $6 here, and 4 workers and pay $8 there. So when taking this action, you have to pay $2 for every worker you have to use. And once again, this can be a mix of cowboys and wild workers. Wild workers can be used as engineers, cowboys, or train conductors. So in this example, the player could buy a 1, 2, or 3 worker cost cow. Let's say, for instance, that the player decided to discard 1 cowboy and buy the 1 cost card. The cowboy card would go into their discard pile. They would be able to get it back later in the game, and the cow that they purchased will also go into their discard pile, which means that they'll draw it later on a future turn. It's important to note that players can only buy 1 cow per action. If a player visits this tile and decides to take this build a building action, they would be able to build any of the face-up buildings from the common building display, discarding workers and paying costs in the same way as if they were buying a cow. So for instance, to build this building, a player would have to discard 5 engineers and or wild workers and pay $2 per worker discarded. Let's say, for instance, that the player decided to build this building. The player could then pick any unoccupied building space on the main board to place the building on. It is important to note that some building spaces will cost money to build there, so for instance, if a player wanted to put the building here, they would have to pay 1 coin from their supply. And once a building is built, a player would put their player marker on top of it to show that that building is theirs. One very important note about buildings as well is that it's also possible to overbuild a building. So for instance, if a player wanted to build this 5 cost building and not have to discard 5 workers and pay $10, they could instead build on top of a building that they've already constructed and only pay for the difference. So for instance, if the red player wanted to build this 5 cost building on top of this 3 cost building that they've already built, they could do so simply by discarding 2 workers and paying $4, as that's the difference between 3 and 5. If a player decides to overbuild in this way, they would replace the building that they've already built, put their marker on top of it to show that they own this new building, and return the previously built building to the supply, which would allow it to be built again. It's important to note that players don't have to pay the cost of building in the space, again, if they are overbuilding a building that's already been constructed. And it's also important to note that each player only has 2 ownership markers, so each player can at most build 2 buildings. The last type of action that would require workers will be using a train. If a player visits this location and takes this action, they would be able to use the train. In a similar way to buying cows or building buildings, players would have to discard workers and spend money to visit the different train locations shown here. So for instance, if a player discarded 1 engineer and paid $2, they would be able to visit this train car, taking both of these actions in any order that they want. This action would allow a player to gain 1 new achievement tile and gain an exchange token. If a player discarded 2 engineers and or wild workers and then paid $4, they could get 1 new bonus tile from the display and take an auxiliary action. This tile would allow a player to gain both an end-of-game achievement and bonus tile, and this tile would allow a player to gain 3 temporary certificates on their track, either a bonus tile or an end-of-game achievement, and then move 2 spaces, and do a new action at the space where they land. We'll look at the effects of all of the bonus tiles and end-of-game achievement tiles in more detail here in a moment. But whenever gaining a new bonus tile or end-of-game achievement tile, you can select one of the face-up tiles, or you can select a tile from the top of the stack if you don't see something that you like in the display. After a player has moved and then taken actions on any of the tiles where they land, they would then draw up to their full hand size if they've used or discarded any cards during the turn. At the start of the game, everyone's hand size is 4 cards. Through making deliveries and upgrading, a person could eventually get to a hand size of 5. But in this example, let's say that this player has 3 cards in their hand. At the end of their turn, they would need to draw 1 to get back to their hand of 4. If while drawing cards to refill their hand, a player draws a worker card, that worker card would immediately be placed back in their worker area below their player board, and then they would continue drawing until they've reached their full hand size. If a player ever needs to draw a card and their draw pile is empty, they would shuffle their discard pile, including any new cards they've gained by taking actions, making a new draw pile, and then draw from that until they've reached their full hand size. After a player's draw step, it would then be the next player's turn in clockwise order. Now that we've looked at almost all of the actions in more detail, we'll look at what happens whenever a player moves to El Paso. As mentioned earlier in the video, if a player ever moves to El Paso, they have to stop, and they would then complete all of these steps before ending their turn. First, the player would gain 5 coins from the supply. Then, if there are any more of these Simmental cattle, they would gain 1 of those cows, putting it in their discard pile, just like if they were gaining another type of cow. After that, they would then make a delivery of their cattle herd. Whenever delivering their herd, players would gain value for each unique type of cow they have in their hand. So for instance, this player would have a herd worth 2, 4, 5. They wouldn't count the second Criollo card because it's not unique, it's a duplicate. This would give them a base value of 5 for their herd. In addition, players can increase the value of their herd by spending temporary certificates, or if they have any ongoing certificate values. For instance, if a player has unlocked this bonus, they would have an ongoing benefit of 1 extra value of their cows, so their herd would now be worth 6. And if they decided to spend all 4 of their temporary certificates, they could increase their herd's value by 4 more, bringing the total to 10. Players would then be able to deliver one of their discs from their board based on the value of their herd. This will remove some of the discs, potentially unlocking new actions, or unlocking better abilities like moving further or having a bigger hand size. Once again, it's important to note that if players choose to unlock a disc that has a cost associated, they will either gain coins or pay coins depending on if the symbol is positive or minus. It's also important to note that these discs with the dark corners can only be delivered to spaces on the main board that have dark shading around their corners as well. And these are the spaces on the track where players can deliver their markers. So for instance, with a herd value of 10, the yellow player could deliver to this dark shaded space right here. We'll say for instance that this player decided to unlock their bigger hand size, delivering their yellow disc here. A player can only deliver to each space once, with the exception of any of these spaces that show multiple circles. So for instance, players can deliver to the 12 space as many times as they want, to the 16 space as many times as they want, and to the 0 space as many times as they want. But once a player delivers to one of these spaces showing a single circle, they can't deliver another one of their discs there. Other players, however, could come and deliver their discs there if they haven't gone there already. And when players deliver to certain spaces, they'll gain immediate or end-of-game rewards. For instance, this player would gain 2 points at the end of the game for having a disc here, and they would gain a temporary certificate right away, moving their marker up on their track. If a player were to deliver here, they would gain 9 points at the end of the game and immediately receive an exchange token. And if players were to deliver here, they would receive a coin. Here they would once again receive a temporary certificate marker. Here they would receive one of the achievement tiles, either from the face-up display or the top of the stack. And if they were to deliver here, they would get to hire 1 worker for free. Of course, if they hired a wild worker, it would still cost 4 extra. After a player has completed all of the steps on the El Paso tile, they would then draw up to their hand size, and then it would be the next player's turn. On their following turn, the player would start from the El Paso tile and move their normal step value and take actions, starting the loop again. Now that we've looked at a player's turn and covered the steps of what happens when a player reaches El Paso, we're going to look at the end-of-game objective tiles, bonus tiles, and some of the common building actions in more detail, so you'll know what these symbols mean. The end-of-game objective tiles give players points at the end of the game if they've completed certain objectives. Many of these symbols will refer to the same thing once you get the iconography down, but we'll look at a few examples here. This tile would give a player 4 points at the end of the game if they have this specific cow in their deck. This tile would give a player 4 points at the end of the game if they've placed at least one disc on the 16 space by delivering at El Paso. This tile would give a player 4 points at the end of the game if they've built a building that has at least a 4 worker value or greater. This tile would give a player 4 points at the end of the game if they have a building that's worth 3 workers or more, and if they have a bonus tile in their supply. Any bonus tile will work. This tile would give a player 4 points if they have a bonus tile in their supply, and if they have a disc on the 14 space or higher. This tile would give a player 4 points if they have a value 3 cow and a bonus tile, etc., and all of these tiles work in a similar way. Bonus tiles will also give you a number of different effects throughout the game. Their effects can be either immediate or ongoing, and they'll be worth a number of victory points as well. This bonus tile, for instance, would be worth 1 point at the end of the game, and it would allow you to gain value for 1 duplicate card when you deliver in El Paso. This bonus tile will give players 2 points at the end of the game, and give them a permanent ongoing certificate value whenever they turn in their cattle. This bonus tile would give a player 3 points at the end of the game, and allow them to complete 3 exchanges 1 time when they get the tile. This bonus tile would be worth 3 points and would immediately give players 5 coins, and this bonus tile would be worth 2 points at the end of the game, would immediately let a player remove 1 card from their hand from the game completely, and gain 4 coins right away. Many of these action icons you might recognize from earlier in the video, but some of them may look slightly different. This icon, for instance, will allow you to discard a cow of any color and type for 2 coins. This icon means that you can take 2 auxiliary actions, but they have to be different. And this icon means that you would simply gain a card of that type into your deck, following the normal rules, placing it in your discard pile. As you unlock the different aspects of your player board, you will either power up your auxiliary actions, unlock new auxiliary actions that you can take, or increase your herd's value, increase your hand size, or move farther on your turn. Once this disc is removed, every time you take this action you would gain 3 coins instead of 1. Once this action is unlocked, you would gain 1 on your certificate track. Once this action is upgraded, you would be able to complete 2 exchanges back to back. And once this action is unlocked whenever you take it, you would be able to remove 1 card from your hand from the game completely. Players will keep playing the game until the last card from this deck has been removed. When this happens, the game will continue until the next player reaches El Paso. And when that happens, instead of taking one of the cards from this area, they will place their worker on this space and gain a slight bonus at the end of the game for making it there. Then each other player will get 1 final turn, and the game will end and final scoring will take place. It's also important to note that if a player reaches El Paso after this space is already occupied, they wouldn't move their worker there, they would simply remain in El Paso. When determining the final score, players will score points for any locations where they have a disc that has a point value. They'll score points for all of their cattle. They'll score points for any of the buildings that they've built. They'll gain 1 point for every $5 they have remaining. They'll total up the points from all of their different workers, as well as any points on bonus tiles and in-game objectives. It is important to note that if something is used to complete an in-game objective, it can't be used for another objective. Each objective has to be filled with unique things. So for instance, these 2 bonus tiles are used to complete this objective, which means that this player wasn't able to fully complete this objective by getting a 3rd bonus tile. So they would simply score nothing for this objective, but it wouldn't penalize them. The player with the highest total would win the game, and if there's a tie, the player that has more money left over would win, and if there's still a tie, the victory is shared. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, make sure and comment below or email me directly at thediceyreview@gmail.com, and I'll be sure to answer those questions for you if I can. As always, if you're enjoying the content that we put out, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever we put out new content in the future. Alright everybody, thanks so much, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.